Sadie is a recognized oil painter, classical painter. She's going to tell us a story about how she grew up in an art school and went through school where they didn't really have the tools and techniques that the painters of old had. I'm sure you've all seen in the 20th century, you've seen a work of art and you've said, yeah, you know, I know a 5-year-old who can do that because it's just a blank white canvas or something silly. Well, you know, that's interesting art and maybe provocative in some ways, but it also meant we lost the ability to create beautiful things that represent reality. And so Sadie is going to talk about her journey. Danielle and I have gone from drawing stick figures to actually drawing human body parts that look, you know, that have depth and shading. So it's also just a great story in education outside the current system. So I'll leave it there. I would love to have Sadie come up and tell her story. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Okay. Can you hear me all right? All right. Yeah, so I teach an art school, so it's a little bit different change of pace. When Danielle and Mike asked me to come teach, come talk here today, I know that they invest in technology, but when they described it to me of what they're particularly interested in is finding people who are finding their own path outside of the degree program system. I was very interested in that because I have big problems with degrees in my own field, and I think they were interested in to find out that I had major critiques of university systems and art school systems for art education, and that really dovetailed with a lot of their ideas. So they were doing a lot of thinking in between their careful renderings of human body parts and brainstorming about how what they were doing connected to what I was doing. So I always think that when you are, I'm 46 now, and looking at the crowd, I might actually be on the older side of the spectrum and of people here. And what I always find is that basically you spend cycles of your whole life coming back to what you wanted to do when you were about 16 years old. And you will find over and over again, you'll reach moments in your life where you're like, you know, I'm not doing what I always loved to do, what I always wanted to do. And essentially getting back in touch with what first fired you up, what first made you excited, what first made you feel like you had a very unique way of accessing your skills and that you just want to get to be able to develop those skills as much as possible, hopefully make money, hopefully get recognized for them. But essentially, every single time you need a reset in your life, you go back to that original thing. What did I love when I was 14, 15, 16, 17 years old? What was I really good at? What made me feel like me? When I was in high school, I really liked to draw. Probably if you weren't the artist in your high school, you knew who the artist was in your high school. It's usually about 1 in 100 kids gets to be the artist, right? You knew one guy or one girl who was like the drawer. So I was that person. I loved to draw. That's all I really wanted to do. And in high school, I just really wanted to draw like this. This is Michelangelo. And I didn't know much about art history, but I'd gotten a little introduction to art history. And when I saw Michelangelo's drawings, I was just like, you know, it really just doesn't get any cooler than this. You've got red chalk on toned paper, which basically always makes something look cool. And you've got this really, really muscular, interesting body part, interesting human figure showing a difficult pose. And how would you ever even hope to be able to do that? But I'm going to tell you about how I went to art school and did not learn what I wanted to learn. But first I want to find out, is there anybody in the room, I can't see you, so don't raise your hand, but you could just shout it out. Does anybody in the room recognize either of these two artists? Starry Night by Van Gogh. Monet, and those are, it's a bridge, but what's under the bridge? Water lilies, Monet's water lilies. So these are probably two of the most famous. If you study art history in any tiny overview course, you'll be introduced to these two artists. These artists were working in the late 19th century, And as we know that they worked on their own personal vision, what they were really excited about outside of the system, outside of the regime for art education, and they really brought a new look to art. However, the path that they started on has become, the avant-garde has essentially become the system now. So I'm going to talk to you about what else was going on in the 19th century. I have a feeling, if you do know it, yell really loud, but I have a feeling nobody can name either of these two art painters. Do you know these painters? Anybody? Venus on the Half Shell by who? No. These two artists were two of the most famous, wealthy, recognized artists in the late 19th century at the same time as these two artists. This is Solomon J. Solomon on the left. Weird name. If you'd heard it once, you might remember it. I had never heard it once until I was well past art school. Bouguereau, you will learn now about in art school, but they weren't teaching about art school. They weren't teaching him in art school in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, or probably about 2010. They might mention him with a sneer. These two artists were not only obviously reached a very high skill level, but extremely respected in every aspect of life. In fact, Bouguereau received the Legion of Honor in France. He's a French artist. The Legion of Honor is something that is bestowed for both military and civil excellence by the state. Essentially, it's their Nobel Prize or an Olympic award. Huge, huge award. For being an artist, it's hard to imagine that today. It's a little bit like the Academy Awards, like a major director. Solomon J. Solomon was hired to paint the Queen Mary, and he eventually became the president of the Royal Society of British Artists. He was a British artist. So these are two artists among many at the time who were they both were wealthy in their lifetimes due to just selling art and doing portrait commissions. And both of them were very well established at a very early age. The painting by Solomon J. Solomon on the left was done when he was 27 years old. And I think that's kind of amazing, but there's a way that if I ever did see these kinds of paintings when I was younger, I kind of thought of them as like a magical story. Sometime in the past, some people, sometime, somewhere, were able to draw and paint better than anybody I knew, but that didn't happen anymore. Somehow, humanity just couldn't do that anymore. We're not capable of it anymore. It's ancient past. It sounded sort of like a Bible story or a Greek myth. Like, oh yeah, people used to be able to walk on water and they used to be able to draw and paint. Let's take a look at this painting. Can you imagine any high school student today even looking at this painting and saying, oh yeah, in about 6 or 7 years I'm going to be able to do this? Do you know anybody alive today? These figures are almost life-size. This painting is huge. This painting is completely imagined from nothing. This artist, Solomon J. Solomon, came up with a theme, an idea. This is the story of Samson and Delilah. And he said, I want to make a really great painting that shows everything I can do at age 27 so that people hire me. And I want to show how awesome I am. So he imagines the scene, he imagines the figures, he hires the models, he has the models pose, he does drawings, he does studies of these, he composes the entire thing. I don't know if you know this story, but if you look at this guy's eye, see right there? I don't know if you can see my pointer. The eye of the top guy, it's really white, right? It's really blinding. It's really kind of piercing out of the darkness. Well, in the story of Samson and Delilah, he has his eyes gouged out after he is caught, after his hair is cut off. And so when you know that, you start looking around for a knife, right? They're about to gouge his eyes out. Can you see down here in the lower left-hand corner? This looks like a very, very scary utensil that has one thing it's supposed to do, and that's to gouge eyes out. I mean, this is a scary, scary painting. But the ability to show these figures in this way, wrapping around each other, wrestling with each other in this very, very intense scene, this very circular composition, you're not just born knowing how to do this. You have to train to learn how to do this. And you are expected to be able to conceive of a painting like this and make a painting like this if you went to art school in the late 19th century. Like the late 19th century is not that long ago. We're talking about your grandmother's childhood or your grandmother's parents' childhood. It's not that long ago. It's not ancient history. So if you are a 18, 19-year-old and your dream is to make a painting like this, what do? Who do you look at? You try and find somebody who's made a painting like what you want to make. And so J. Solomon is looking at paintings. This painting on the left, and the top left, is by Van Dyck. It was hanging in London, and Solomon J. Solomon lived in London, so we know he saw this painting. You can tell by looking at the two paintings that Solomon J. Solomon in 1887 looked at Van Dyck's painting, done 250 years before, and he's referencing it. Not only is he referencing it, he's telling a story and he's composing the figures. He's actually trying to be better than Van Dyck. Van Dyck, one of the histories of art history, one of the masters of art history, one of the most famous people. He's saying, I'm going to up Van Dyck. I'm going to be even more amazing than Van Dyck. And it worked. He got portrait commissions and interior design commissions for the rest of his life. He was a very successful artist you have never heard of. You can go to art school and never hear of him. You can study figure drawing and figure painting and want to make figure paintings, never hear about this artist. And so what are we doing in art school? And I think this kind of thing happens a lot. There's a way that education gets systematized and ideas get really solid, and you're learning from teachers who are learning from teachers from a couple decades before, and they're sort of regurgitating these same ideas, and you can get really caught in this way. So if you want to paint a painting like this, if you're a young art student and you're looking at art history, first thing you have to do is figure out how to draw a figure. This is a figure drawing probably by about an 18-year-old in the late 18th century. This guy's not famous. This artist did not become famous. This artist became to a standard skill level for an 18-year-old in the late 19th century. You were expected to be able to do this. You were expected to be able to draw like this if you were an art student in the late 19th century. This was considered normal. I don't know about any of you, but if I had a friend who drew like this, I would hang out with them a lot. All right? What is this art student looking at, and what is this art student's teachers looking at? This art student's teachers are looking all the way back to Michelangelo, 500 years before, 400 years before. What's Michelangelo looking at? Michelangelo is looking at this. This is the Belvedere torso. This is discovered and exhibited in Rome starting in about 1430, about 80 years before Michelangelo drew it. This was known, it was dug up. In the Renaissance, people started to become really interested in what the ancient Greek and Romans had been doing. This is from 1st century BC. They've recently figured out that this is not an original sculpture. This sculpture is a copy of a sculpture that was 100 years before that. So we have a lineage going on here. This is a 19th century drawing of this 1st century BC sculpture, which is in itself a copy of a previous sculpture. We have a lineage going on of people are figuring out how to draw and paint the human being expressive, telling a story in a way that resonates across the ages, and they are learning from their teachers how to do this. And there's an unbroken lineage. If the talk was longer, I could tell you the unbroken lineage between this sculpture on the left and this drawing on the right. This drawing on the right is by Charles Bargue. He can name his teacher, Jerome. Jerome can name every single teacher of his teacher all the way back to Michelangelo. Unbroken lineage of paintings we can find and look at and see. This is what a typical art student would do. This is by a very young art student. These were done by a very young art student who became a very famous painter. These were done when he was about 12 or 13 years old. He's kind of ahead of the game. He's doing pretty well. You can see in the lower left-hand corner, that's our Belvedere torso right there. So he's looking at this drawing. It's a copy exactly of this drawing. It's not great, but he's 12, right? Okay, he's 12. Anybody have any guess who this artist is? Probably the most famous artist of the 20th century. Picasso. That's this guy. So what do we do in art school now? 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, all the way up till now. What do we do in art school now? We look at this, and we draw this. I went to Rhode Island School of Design. I graduated in 1993. I was curious what they're doing now. I Google Rhode Island School of Design figure drawings. This is the page of drawings that comes up. This is exactly what I was doing with them in 1993. It makes sense that they're drawing this because they're trying to draw this. They're trying to be this. But this was not Picasso's path to this. This was Picasso's path. This was Picasso's path. Learning what you're passionate about, learning how to express things, drawing from art history, and then launching it further is the way to be revolutionary. You're not a revolutionary by copying revolutionaries. Look at the drawing on the left. This is one of, I'm not picking on anybody. I don't even know this guy's name. It just comes up when you Google RISD figure drawings. So this guy on the left, lower left, that's actually a pretty good drawing. I actually think that he did better than I could have done in art school at RISD. So I blew that one up. That's quite a contrast, right? I mean, most of us would be proud to make this drawing on the left. It looks like a person. It looks somewhat like a person, right? It's even referencing art history. It's like toned paper, right? It looks a little bit historical-ish, but you compare it to what's on the right of what a standard, non-famous art student at 18 years old did on the right 100 years before. We've lost something. We've lost something crucial and extremely important that we are not finding in established art institutions, established art education, because we're trying to do this. It makes sense if you're trying to do this, that we are doing figure drawing like that. A quick nod to art history and then quick get on and at 18 years old try and make something the world has never seen before. If you're lucky, you'll be like Basquiat. Somebody will pluck you out of the gutter, give you a free art studio in New York City in the 80s for a year to make a solo show that is sold out before opening night, and you'll be a millionaire and you'll die of a heroin overdose 5 years later. That's the dream, okay? This is a drawing I did right after my last year at RISD, 1994, on the right. The one on the left is the one I'm trying to do. The one on the right is everything I could figure out from RISD. RISD's right next door to Brown. Best opportunity I had was taking anatomy classes from a head anatomy instructor over at Brown University. He also taught us all about the nervous system and the guts and all that, which I don't care about at all as an artist. I just wanted the bones and muscles part. He's a great biology teacher, one of the best things I did. So I had a little bit of anatomy, and I'm trying to do, I've got the red chalk, I've got the toned paper, with the brown paper. That'll make any drawing look cool. If you want to learn to draw, just do it in red chalk on brown paper that you're halfway there. You know, but I'm not where I want to be. I'm not where I want to be, right? I can tell I'm okay. I was good at RISD. I got all A's. I got all prizes in the shows. I was told I was a great artist. There was nowhere for me to go. I wasn't an illustrator. I wasn't an animator. I wanted to be a fine art, figurative painter. I had no idea what to do. I had one professor tell me once, "You look like you're interested in representational figurative work. I think there's a gallery in New York that you might be interested in, but I don't know the name of it." Most of my painting teachers did big black canvases, because every decade or so, black canvases are in the opposite decade, white canvases are in. All right, so we were in a black canvas decade. A little bit of texture, maybe. 8-foot black canvases was my painting teacher. I did have a few good painting and drawing teachers at RISD, but there's no sense of continuity, no understanding of how we were connected to 500 years of art history, no understanding of how you felt in a story by looking at a human being. And for us as human beings to look at another human being and feel a story is one of the most powerful ways of visual communication. There was no sense that this was even more than a cursory goal that you would spend a couple years, maybe 1 year, freshman year, and then you'd move on and try and do something brand new that the world had never seen before. Between these two drawings, 10 years went by. From my early 20s to my early 30s, I decided I was not an artist. There was no path. There was no visible path for me an artist. Even though I'd been an artist my entire childhood, even though I went to the best art school in the country, even though I got straight A's at the best school in the country, even though I graduated with honors and I was accepted into all the top juried exhibitions within my school, I came out with no understanding of how to be an artist, how to get better, what being an artist meant, and I was in a cultural vacuum. If I was lucky, I would have heard by word of mouth about some guy who was doing amazing paintings in New York. If I had slipped my phone number underneath his door, I might have gotten a glimpse of the education I was looking for. This man was named Jacob Collins. He is only 5 years older than me, and he was teaching traditional figurative realist art based on a 500-year-old tradition, and I missed it. Reconnected with him later. Over these 10 years, this is part of my story. I could probably do a whole nother talk for all you guys. You guys would love to hear about it. I was a graphic designer. I ended up joining a startup with my father. My father is a software engineer. Two of us joined a startup in the late 90s, got bought, relocated in early 2000 to San Francisco. It was our dot-com dream. Market tanked, got laid off. I had just signed a lease. I'm in San Francisco for a lease that is 3 times my lease back in Boston, and my rent is 3 times, and I had no job, no health insurance, no nothing. So whatever, if you do get lucky enough to start a company and get paid by a company, you make sure you got a little backup there. Things can happen. Economic downturn, had to reinvent my life, had to think about what I was doing. I was a graphic designer the whole time. I was a good graphic designer, and I continued to be a graphic designer. But the entire time, I kept thinking, I especially really liked being a graphic designer when I thought it was going to make me rich. That was a really good time. But I got thinking, you know, this is not what I didn't dream of being a graphic designer. I dreamed of being a figurative painter. I always wanted to do that, and I was good, and I didn't understand why I hadn't gone further. I didn't understand, how do I pick up these loose ends? How do I move forward? So in the meantime, the internet happened in that 10 years, from the early 90s to the early 2000s. I started looking around. For the first time, whatever you're interested in, whether you're making glass beads, whether you're designing code, whether you're an artist, you can find teachers. You can find teachers on the internet. And you can go to them and study with them. And that's what I started doing, and what I found out is that there are lots of people like me that went to art school, went to any kind of university for anything, and were deeply disappointed that they did not reach their childhood dreams. That you can love something and be extremely good at it, and you can go to the top school and pay a lot of money and be in a lot of debt and still not get what you thought you were being told you were going to be able to get. That can happen in a lot of different fields, and that's what happened to me. But now, I don't have to try and hear by word of mouth some guy who's teaching what I want to learn a couple hours from me and slip a note under his door with my phone number, my landline. I don't have to do that anymore, right? You can find the teachers that you want to teach, that you want to study with. I taught a few years ago at Academy of Art University. I was stunned. I asked the first day, how many of you Googled me before you showed up for class the first day? 1 kid in 20. This is about 8 years ago. 1 kid in 20 raised his hand, said, yeah, he looked at my work. I'm like, really? You have this enormous power to research your teachers. Find who has what you want. Use it. You know, don't just, and I think that university system really does emphasize that. Well, I'm just going to pay a lot of money. I'm going to show up every day. I'm going to do my homework, and knowledge is going to just come into me passively. I'll just show up with whoever the university says I should study with. I'm going to get my grades. I'm going to get my degree, and then I'm going to be what I want to be. We have more power than we have ever had before. We're the most free people in the world to be here now in this room, to be able to find any resources that you need. The number one thing you just got to do is think about who you were at 16, 17, 18, what fired your soul, and then go find the people that can help you get there. Tap into all the knowledge that is available. So the drawing on the left was done when I was about 31. The drawing on the right done when I was about 34. 2-3 years, I crammed in the education that I wish I'd gotten when I was younger. I know I'm not speaking to artists, but I hope you can tell that the drawing on the right is better than the drawing on the left. Thank you. Okay. Do I have another minute? I'm not done yet. Do I have another comment? Okay, all right. So this is a painting I did in my early 30s, and this is one I did 3 years later. All right. Focusing on figure drawing. I'm not studying painting, I'm studying figure drawing. I'm studying drawing because drawing makes you able to paint, right? This is a drawing I did last year, and I did it as a demonstration for my art class where I teach. I now teach 100 adult students at a school in Potrero Hill, 100 students a week. And what I'm finding is that the more visible I am with my artwork, the more I find people who had the same problem I did. They didn't find the education that they wanted when they wanted. Luckily, we now have people in their 20s who are finding it when they want it, but half my students are in their 20s before 35, half my students are post 55 after their kids are in high school or college. And the post 55 people are weeping because you could not find this. This is what so many people wanted and we could not find it. And ironically, it's the power of modern technology, it's the power of the internet that is tapping us back into these ancient traditions that are giving us the tools to be able to do what we want to do. Obviously, I am consciously working in a tradition. I am doing my best. I'll spend my whole life trying to draw like Michelangelo. I'll be really, really close when I'm 90. I'm going to get better every single year. I get better every single year. Your talent is not marked at 18 and capped. Your talent is only limited by how hard you work every year and finding the right teachers, finding the right mentors, tapping into what you're good at and growing it and pushing it as hard as you can possibly can. These are works by my students. I never saw anybody in my art school, peers or teachers, doing any drawings this good. Never. And now my students are doing these drawings. I just want to wrap it up by saying there is a deep resource in the past. There is hundreds of years of human knowledge that is waiting to be discovered and rediscovered. Every single person in this room had a shitty education compared to a very rich 19th century education. We have very, very narrow, if you studied in another country, you probably had a much better education for those of us in the room who studied in America. You have to proactively make up for that. You have to study all aspects of history. You have to study all the ideas that came before. If hearing today about Martin Luther is the first time you've heard of that and you're not really quite sure what this whole list thing is, just at least look it up on Wikipedia, you know? It's so easy to tap into information. It's so easy to get what you want, but you have to make the effort, and the only reason that you can make the effort is if you dive deep into that inspiration you had when you were 16, 17, 18 years old, and that's all you want to do, and you're going to go through walls to get there. Thank you.